Hey guys, welcome back to the Hybrid Athlete channel. I am Dr. Paul Rimmer, and on today's little section on Sports Science Shorts, we're going to talk about estimating fuel usage in terms of total energy demand of certain activities, and also what proportion of glucose or glycogen or fatty acids, so the fuels we store in the body that we use for these kind of activities, what proportion of those that we're using, so we can work out some fueling strategies. Now, if you haven't checked out my last video where I talked about what's called a respiratory exchange ratio, which isn't easy to say, where I talk about why we measure breath by breath analysis of oxygen uptake and carbon dioxide exhalation, and how that tells us about fuel usage, then please just take a second to go and watch that video. Okay, so I've linked that here. Now, if you want to plow through and just ignore all that, you can, but some of this might seem a little bit like, well, where are you getting those numbers from? But just trust me, if you watch that video, this one will make a little bit more sense. But if you want to stick with me, you've seen it already, let's continue on our little journey. So, we know that oxygen consumption is related to fuel usage, right? That's why we breathe. So when what we've tried to do is create what scientists tried to do is create this idea of what's called a metabolic equivalent, okay, or a MET. Now, why have we done that? We've done that because it allows us to compare across different activities so we can really quickly and easily estimate fuel usage. And I'll talk about, if that doesn't make sense at this point, don't worry, hopefully it'll all become clear. So one MET is the equivalent of 3.5 times the total amount of oxygen we're consuming in milliliters per minute per kilogram of body weight, okay? So if we know that one MET is basically the equivalent of, and if we do some funky calculations and estimations of this, one MET also equals, and this is where things might become clear of how we use this to calculate fuel, total calorie needs per exercise per hour, and also fuel usage, is one MET is also the equivalent of 1 calorie per kilogram of body weight per hour as well, okay? Now, the important thing at this is this measurement here, this 3.5 times, and both of these are at rest, okay? So a 1 MET activity is just basically quietly sitting. Now, what happens if we go to a 3 MET activity or a 4 MET activity? How do we know this, okay? Well, there's a couple of things I've linked. So in the description, I've linked something. I've linked the link. I've put a link in to what is called a physical activity compendium. And what they've done is they basically measured the oxygen demand of loads of different activities, okay? Everything from doing housework to running at high intensities, to cycling, to swimming, to rock climbing. Pretty much any activity that you can think of, you'll find a comparison where in a laboratory setting, in a clinical setting, they've measured oxygen uptake. And then that has allowed them to then look and say, okay, we know this is 1 MET, then how do we translate that to the amount of oxygen that's being used in a different exercise, which gives us these MET values. So we might have a 3 MET value for something, 5 MET value for walking, like a 12 MET value for like really high intensity exercise. So how can we use this? Well, first and foremost, what I'm going to do is I've also put a link in the description to a spreadsheet that I've created, which will allow you to use this information today to do 2 things. It will allow you to estimate your total calorie demands per hour of specific intensity exercises or specific efforts. And again, you can use that combined with the physical activity compendium in order to calculate fuel usage because of this stuff we've just discussed. And also, it will also allow you to estimate the amount of carbohydrates or glycogen or glucose that we're using relative to fats. So, one thing that's cool about this then is at rest, let's do a quick bit of maths, okay? And I'm going to use this, I've tried to do this with different numbers, but for the sake of brevity, let's say I weigh 100 kilos. I weigh 90 kilos. So if I weigh 100 kilos, so we're talking about me now, not nets, right? If I weigh 100 kilos, that means at rest, I am burning close to 100 calories per hour. Now remember, these are just estimates, okay? There's going to be various things that affect this, lean mass, and particularly as we become more active, lean mass becomes, ratio of lean mass percentage or body fat percentage or lean mass percentage becomes more prevalent in terms of the impact this will have. Remember guys, these are just estimations. There are also other things that will shift fuel usage, training status, nutrition, blah, 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 blah. Remember, these are just estimations to get a good guideline of maybe what we should do nutritionally to fuel our performance during specific exercises. It's not the holy grail, you know, it's not the, think of this as like having the map, it's not the exact location GPS signal, it's just giving us a rough idea. So please just use that in your mind, keep that idea in your mind as we're carrying it forwards. Now, so for me, I burn 100 calories per hour at rest according to this, okay? What's interesting is, if you go to a website, my personal favourite one, which has got different estimations, calculations for various populations to estimate resting metabolic rate, and actually most people's predicted resting metabolic rate that I found when I test in the clinic with my actual equipment versus what they're predicted is usually within a few percentage unless there's medically something wrong. So the chances are if you use an online resting metabolic rate calculator, you'll probably find that it's actually pretty close to what you would measure in a lab. That's true of most people, right? Now, what you can do is use one of those and see what it spits out as your resting metabolic rate each day, and then you can just divide that by 24 to see how close that is to this equivalent of what your one met would be, or your resting energy metabolic rate. So let's say I go onto a calculator and it says that my resting metabolic rate, so I put in my age, my height, my gender, whatever information it asks for, and let's say it spits out my resting metabolic rate at say 2,400 calories, then I would divide that by the 24 hours in a day to get my hourly rate, and then we would compare those two values there, okay? Now obviously in this situation, I've fudged the numbers, and it is to make those match for the sake of argument, but you would find that the difference between this and this should be very small, and it's also a good way of checking whether you've got this right, because if there's a big difference there, it usually means maybe we put the wrong number into a formula or done something wrong. Okay, so we now know that on a 1 met activity, chilling out, sitting, doing not very much, I'm burning 100 calories an hour if I weighed 100 kilos. You know, former Dr. P, who was a bigger, heavier guy, burned 100 calories an hour. And let's say then I'm doing a 5 met activity, so I'm doing 500 calories an hour, a 10 met activity, 1,000 calories per hour. Right, don't worry about what all these met activities are, because like I said, they're in the compendium that I've linked in the description. So what about fuel usage? Right, this is where we need to get super clever. And again, we're going to keep this idea of 100 kilo me, 100 calories per hour, and we're going to look at doing, say, a 3 met activity. So a 3 met activity, for me, would be, if I was, you know, still 100 kilos, around 300 calories per hour, okay? I want to keep that idea in our heads for a second. And this is where we have to be a little bit clever, and this is where our estimations come into just being very sort of like broad, but still useful. And we have this thing, physiologically what happens, we don't have this thing, physiologically what happens is, if we have exercise intensity across the bottom, so 0% is completely rested, 100% is maximal effort, you know, anaerobic, pushing ourselves as hard as we can. And then here we have fuel usage as a percentage, okay? So we've got 100% fuel usage and 0% fuel usage there. Now at any given moment, we're obviously, remember this is a proportion, it's a percentage, not a total amount, so it's not calories per hour, it's just a percentage that we're using, okay? So at any given moment, even at rest, I'm still providing 100% of the fuel, it's just that the energy intake is lower, okay? If that makes sense. So the total energy would be lower, but I'm still, you know, at any given time, the energy I'm producing is 100% of the energy that I'm producing, right? Regardless of intensity. What we're going to talk about today, though, is a thing called the crossover effect. So at rest, and blue is going to be fatty acids, so stored body fat, fat in the muscles, dietary fats floating around in our circulatory system. At rest, we have a very high proportion of fatty acids, and as our exercise intensity increases, whoa, this is a bit of a wonky curve, it reduces. This never goes quite down to zero, because some tissues in the body will still be using fatty acids for something. And carbohydrates, which is going to be our red pen, they start moderately low. Again, we'll still be using some blood glucose, because, you know, there's certain processes in the body that have to use glucose. Like, for example, red blood cell energy production relies entirely on glucose. It's anaerobic, so glucose metabolism is the only way to do it. As exercise intensity increases, we then get this increase effect here, and this is just called the crossover effect. So as we get to a certain intensity of effort, we switch over. Now, why is this important for performance? I'm going to go through this really quickly, okay? This is important for performance because fat reserves in the body are basically infinite for our intents and purposes, okay, for sports. We usually, even very lean people, will have thousands and thousands and thousands of calories worth of stored body fat, right? So, we don't need to worry about fueling fat for performance, typically speaking, okay? We might, I mean, if we're a more fat-adapted athlete type thing, we might look at certain fat sources to get into the body quicker. There's an argument to be made for that, but that's not the argument we're going to have today. I'll discuss that in another video. But for most people with a normal balanced diet, the fact of the matter is we've got enough stored body fat and we can access that body fat easily enough at low enough intensities that we don't need to worry about fueling or adding in extra fats, other than to maybe just make up some calorie deficit, to eat some calories if we're doing like a really high volume training day and we just need to eat enough food and we can't get all that from carbohydrates just because there's too much food there. Anyway, that was a segue, not important. Now, the problem is that carbohydrate storage in the body, or glucose storage in the body, is limited to blood glucose, liver in the muscles, glycogen in the muscles and glycogen in the liver. And that's only a few hundred grams that we can store at any one time. But obviously, if we're trying to work at a certain percentage, as we see here, as our exercise intensity increases, our fuel usage shifts more to carbohydrate usage. So that means if we're not providing enough carbohydrate in order to replenish these stocks, that means that at some point we're going to run out of glycogen and our performance is then going to diminish, lower the intensity, so we become more reliant on fatty acids because we just don't have the carbs in the system, okay? Now, that's a whistle-stop tour of why fuel usage is important and why we need to know how many calories we're burning per hour and of what fuel source as well. Now, okay, let's look at this 3-met example. So let's say, and this is just me talking off the top of my head here, so don't think these numbers are right. It's just a like proof of concept or show of concept, maybe not proof of concept. So let's say this is a 1-met activity here, and we've got our 3-met activity, which is about, let's say, 3-met activity is here, okay? Now, what we can do is if we know at a 3-met activity our relative intensity of that, which again, we know from the compendium comes to the rescue again, what I know is at 3 mets, I'm burning 300 calories per hour. But I also now know, because of this graph here, looking at lots of different data across lots of different athletes and lots of different intensities, and particularly if I can find this for the given sport I'm looking at, so if you know your given sport, you could probably go in and dig inside the spreadsheets and find this out to be a little bit more accurate, because muscle contraction type will influence slightly the fuel usage at different intensities. So there's a difference, for example, between running and cycling on this. Whether it's significant enough for what we're going to worry about here, probably not so much so, and that's why I say this is a good guide. But we've got this 3-met activity, and let's say at 3 mets, we're using 75% from fatty acids. Okay, we don't need to worry too much about that, 75%, because we've got enough stored body fat, but we're using 25% of our fuel usage is coming from carbohydrates. Again, these are just rough numbers. So that means if we're burning 300 calories per hour, and we know 25% of that is coming from carbohydrates, because that's the one we're concerned of, that means we are going to be burning around 50 calories per hour. Probably just written that behind the thing so you can't see it. Let's change that. So we're going to be burning 50 calories per hour from carbohydrates, okay? Now, because we know that carbohydrates provide 4 calories per gram, if we then divide this by 4, what we will see is that to maintain performance or to provide enough glucose to make sure we keep stocking up those supplies, that if we take 50 and divide that by 4, I do believe that's 12.5 grams of CHO, carbohydrates, okay? Sorry if that doesn't fit on the board there. So that means that actually, if I've got lots of glycogen, I store several hundred grams, and I'm doing that 3-met activity for a few hours, chances are I'm not going to deplete my glycogen stores if they're full already. I'm not probably going to need to worry about carbohydrate fueling at that level of intensity there, right? At that level of effort. If then, this then shifts so it becomes a 6, 7, 8, 9, what's going to happen is the amount of total energy expenditure is going to go up. So let's say it was a 10-met activity, so that would be 1,000 calories. the proportion of carbohydrate usage is going to go up. So let's say that was 75%, so that's 750 calories per hour. And obviously as a result of that, the grams of carbohydrate is going to go up significantly. And at some point, we will reach a threshold by which the amount of grams of carbohydrate per hour we are burning and utilizing can't be provided from food that we're ingesting or fluids that we're ingesting, carbohydrate gels, powders, drinks, things like that, simply because of the rate of uptake of digestion as well. So this is why this is important to know. So this will always be carbohydrate intake and ingestion, particularly on distances, I'd say up to marathon distance. Beyond that, when you get into like super ultra endurance distances, things get a little bit sketchy with fatigue and stuff, which again is outside the scope of this. But what I'm trying to do here is just give you guys a rough estimation, and you can use your spreadsheet to do this, to work out how many carbohydrates per hour you're actually using during exercise, and then if it's actually worth then needing to think about fueling. It might be that what you find is even a really high intensity exercise, like a 10 minute exercise or 12 minute exercise, if you're only doing that for a short duration, well then obviously the amount of percentage of carbohydrates you're using is going to be higher, but the total energy demand is going to be lower. So let's say I'm doing a 10 minute activity, but I'm only doing that for half an hour, that's 500 calories, okay? Rather than it being, you know, the full 1,000 as well. So if I've got 500 calories and 75% of that calorie is coming from, let's say, carbohydrate, and that equals the equivalent of 400 calories, have I got enough glycogen in the body to provide 400 calories, even though it's a high intensity exercise for 30 minutes? Yes, I do. So that's why one of the suggestions recommendations is that you don't really need to fuel with carbohydrates for activities of less than an hour, because the chances are, even at super high intensities, probably if you're going at that high intensity that you'd burn through it, you're probably going to need to rest, because you're talking about anaerobic stuff, you know, complete glucose, glycogen oxidation, muscle glycogen and liver glycogen usage, muscle glycogen and glucose fuel, like as the primary fuel source. I don't know if that made sense there, but basically using carbs as a fuel source. Even in that situation, the chances are that, you know, for up to an hour, your body's going to have enough storage as well. It's really in these longer duration things of several hours. And again, you could even look at a lower end of the spectrum where maybe you've got like a 5 minute activity, which would be like a walking pace. A period of time, you're still going to be using a certain percentage of carbohydrates that's going to be depleted. So even if it's not necessarily fueling performance, there's sort of neurological demand, like the brain fueling demand from carbohydrates or glucose, blood glucose will be high. So it's still always worth trickling in a little bit of glucose, even in longer, lower intensity events, because we don't really need to worry about fat storage, and maintaining a level of blood glucose is probably going to be good for 2 reasons. 1, alleviating fatigue. 2, increasing, maintaining cognitive performance. And 3, it's probably just going to help a little bit with with food variety and food choice, and just being able to eat something and keep full, right? Okay, so, right guys, hopefully that helped. If you like that, if that was helpful in some way, if you find the spreadsheets useful in some way, if that wasn't too whiffly and waffly, and you got some benefit from this, please give me a like and a subscribe, and I will be back with you very soon with some more sports science shorts, where we will start to discuss a little bit more in detail about fuel usage and the influence of things like exercise intensity and, of course, nutrition and some of the facts and fictions around low carb versus high carb dieting and things like that for performance. Right guys, have a great day. Look after yourselves, you wonderful humans. Peace.